So one question I get asked a lot in regards to the self-defense especially is, how do you fight somebody that's bigger off of you, which is a very common question. But I don't think a lot of people consider the fact that there might be a situation where you're in a scuffle with somebody that is bigger and you get to the ground and now I have to control a bigger person on the ground. So from someone, and if you don't know who Eli Knight is, look him up, but he's been around the jiu-jitsu and grappling game for a while. I'm sure you've gone against some big dudes in the past that you've had to hold down a little bit. And you and I are both somewhat similar size, but we're not massive by any means. But yeah, any positions, like if I'm on the ground, I'm on my back, what positions would you look to focus on in a street situation, and I guess sport, if it's someone that's bigger?
If you're fortunate enough to get on top of the bigger guy, then stay there. Because you don't want to be on bottom, even if you have a good position, especially if it's a street fight. So yeah, whenever you're talking about pinning and holding the top position on bigger dudes, I think the thing that comes to mind obviously is somebody's rotund enough here and you try to get a full mount and your knees floating or something, then it's probably not the best position. So it can take a good position and it can really corrupt the position whenever you try to hold it on somebody who's 350 pounds versus somebody who's 150 pounds. I think side control is an extremely valuable position in ground grappling for self-defense considerations or street fight considerations over the mount necessarily. Now technical mount and stuff notwithstanding, but things that I like that I think are good, I think about being a little bit more of a cage versus a blanket. And there's times for both, right? There's times that you want to have a lot of surface coverage and be very heavy. But when you're going against a bigger dude, and he's significantly bigger, he's going to be able to move you a little bit more efficiently sometimes that way, I feel like. Now, a cage, to juxtapose that to a cage, what I'm talking about is how am I distributing my weight on different points of my body in a way that it keeps a good equal distribution of weight, but is caging in the most functional parts of your movement. So if I think about your shoulders and your hips primarily, right? So we can kind of talk about the wedges of the body. I'm stealing a lot of that terminology from my buddy Jared Jessup, but we think about the hip wedges inside and outside, we think about the armpits, and we think about in between the ear and the shoulder. So those are really functional places where you're going to initiate powerful movements, especially if you're a bigger person. So there are things we could do like knee on belly. Knee on belly gives you a good balance of mobility and stability, right? Because I can move around if you're giving me a lot, like this here. It also gives me the ability to surveil. I can kind of tell what's going on. So that's always a good consideration in a street fight. And if just it's not happening and I need to disengage, then it's pretty easy. It's the easiest position to disengage from and get back to standing. So those are all good things about knee on belly. So learning the difference in how I make this a miserable, oppressive position versus making it a more mobile, tactile position is a really good thing. And the structure of it is this: I'm situated between this point and this point on him. Essentially, I've got my foot probably touching the ground a little bit and kind of hooked to his body. Now, this can be a little bit more centralized and driving into his diaphragm, or I can be a little bit more riding down by his hips. And this one, that's usually a pretty good one, because even if you've got a big belly here, or a big torso, then I'm still going to be able to monitor in that way. So that's one position that I think would be a really good one. And then also the way that I would ride side control, for me is very similar, whether it's a sport situation or a self-defense situation, because what I'm trying to do whenever I get to side control, rather than just be here, even if I'm sprawled and I have good weight distribution, I've got a lot of contact to him, and if he's massive, he's going to roll me a little bit easier, right? So the things that I want to think about getting in position to be able to do, I want to get his arm to the floor and I want to staple it as best I can. So I'm going to use shin staples a lot of the time. Now, if I need to, again, he's 275 pounds, he's 6'4". So how am I going to isolate this arm? Because if I just try here, there's no way. I can't even do that on Dave, and he's not quite 275, I don't think. No. So when we get here, I use my body instead. So if he's here against my body and I roll, then I can kind of sink, and now once it's down, now I can start to think about keeping it there, right? So I'm using my body to get it to the floor, right? But I'm using my hand to staple so that I can come in and get that shin staple. That's right? Nice. Yeah, I like being able to do that, because that's using your torso. Yeah. It's using leverage. Now from here, this is pretty good with this shin staple, but your bridge is still going to be very effective for me. If you buck your hips right now, right, then I have to resituate. So instead, if I take the time to make that hip switch, now if you buck your hips, this is in line with your spine, so this is a little bit of a kickstand that's absorbing a lot of that pressure getting in. Now I can start thinking about isolating this limb over here depending on what you're doing with it. And the same kind of thing, you're going to be trying to probably bench press and everything because you're bigger. But and again, if I try to fight this, I'm making space that's functional for you, yes. So instead, same idea, I want to extend this over so that my body is extending here, right? And with the shin staple, it's keeping this shoulder from getting too much in the game, right? So this is really starting to isolate this arm here now if I start to like try to feed in. And then if you want to look for key locks and stuff, I don't know if I recommend that per se, but it is at least isolating it. And, you know, the situation always kind of dictates that too. So, you know, if I'm talking about riding top positions like that, then I'm thinking about knee on belly. I'm thinking about that side control where it's a little bit more posted versus like sprawled out.
How would you transition from mount to one of those? Would you kind of do it more of like how I'm sure you've done in sport too, where like you ride the wave and as I'm bumping you, you're going to transition, or do you have to be a little bit more cautious because those bumps are going to be bigger?
No, that's a good point, especially because I'll be, if we're, again, using the same context that we're talking about.
Like if you just end up in mount and then realize like, oh shit, like.
Yeah, and I'm kind of
like out here,
yeah, exactly.
And I'm just launching you.
Yeah, so I don't see anything really wrong with posting your hands on the floor, you know, because then if you're trying to buck me or bench press me or whatever, that's a pretty easy, you're actually helping me dismount, right? So getting good at that ability to be able to like cut through and everything like that. So, you know, there's two different ways that you can look at doing it. So I can either dismount straight to knee on belly, right? And then once I get to here, I want to be able to like either keep your head up or down, right? Because here it's a little harder for you to bridge whenever my hand is like this, right? Or by contrast, if you're less about bridging and bucking and more about rotation, then a lot of times this, I call it evangelist control. This takes a lot of that ability out. And this is a really useful tool here. And everybody will have to pay attention to it to some degree. Exactly. And if we're talking about a street fight, as soon as you knock that off, the elbow's coming down right after it, right? So, you know, those kind of things, that's why I've done a few courses on this before about striking efficiency on the ground, and so that really ties into a lot of it, because what happens a lot of times is you get in certain positions and you just want to Donkey Kong the guy. You make those big, powerful movements and they're not as effective as you hope they would be, and you create a lot of space, you sacrifice position. Whereas if you use your striking more efficiently and effectively, it's going to open spaces that you need open and close spaces you need closed. Or I'm going to take away spaces that are going to be beneficial for you, and I'm going to open spaces that are going to be beneficial for me. So that all kind of ties in together as well. Now, so yeah, being able to transition through those and not being too target fixated on, I've got them out, right? I got them out, so I got to hang on to it and unless I'm going to the back, right? And we talked about that too. You have your opinions about getting on the back in a street fight, because whereas, you know, it's the best position you can get in a strictly grappling match, and maybe even in MMA. You know, now
and it could be in the street, but
could be.
You don't know. You don't know nowadays.
Yeah, I think that there's always that liability that whenever you attach yourself so much to the other person, you're giving them influence over your position.
Right.
So that's something you always have to take into account. Now, granted, you're getting a little bit more control over them through that tactile connection, but you know, it's you got to figure out through training, you know, what's the best give and take, and that's where there can be a lot of discrepancy. I think a lot of times between fighting self-defense style in multiple like weird environments versus like a more controlled environment or more controlled rule set, you know. So that's my opinion about some of that stuff.
I think the biggest thing with, at least I found when I grappling with someone that is bigger, I know I can't outmuscle them, and I think that's a big thing, is like you have to kind of have that ego check. Even if it's a street fight, whether it's sport, street, you have to understand, like, okay, the guys, even if you're same weight class, if someone's stronger and you'll feel it, like, I'm not going to try muscling you, but if I can use my body position, like you said, position yourself in a manner where, like, my body is doing the work rather than the power of my arm. Right. Or I'm attacking areas on your body where, like, I may not be able to hold you down, but if I can hold your head in a certain position with my body, your neck is not going to beat my body, and therefore you can't do anything else. So if you can eliminate some of those limbs, and again, it's trial and error. Like if you're watching this and you're in sport, practice this. Work with bigger guys and just say, hey, can I start and mount, and just work on top and just work on trying to keep them down. Because if you've rolled with someone that's bigger than you, you'll know that at any point they can just bench press and throw you away. But
yeah, I think whenever you bring those attributes to bear, that's always going to be you're always going to encounter certain liabilities. So like, and attributes, in my opinion, should compensate for flawed technique. You know, like it should enhance good technique, and it should compensate for flawed technique, versus being overly reliant on those attributes to get the job done. Right. So sometimes it may just boil down to, you know, I can't necessarily beat you physically in a race or a muscle to this position and control you muscularly, but I can create a position that's awkward enough that you're going to have to do something kind of stupid, or you're going to have to really offer me something to be able to get yourself out of it, right? Yeah, so I'm in total agreement with that for sure.
Well, there you have it. Beat on the bigger people. Give it a shot.